In this video, I want to show you how to set up Visual Studio and use Visual Studio's built-in designers to design nice and professional layouts for our DBNetsoft ScreensPro software. First, we need to download Visual Studio and install the appropriate parts. We go to visualstudio.microsoft.com and download the Community Edition. Download will start, and we start the exe setup file. The only things we really need for ScreensPro layouts is .NET desktop development, After installation is complete, we close the installer. Once the installer has completed, we start Visual Studio by using the Start menu. We want to create a new project. From the list of projects, we search for WPF user controls. There's a couple of them. Make sure that you use the one that says C# and the one that is not saying .NET Framework. So in this case, this one here. We give it a name, sample project ScreensPro. You see where the project will be created, and we click Next. Here in the framework, you can stick to .NET 8.0, and we create the project. What we do not need are the automatically generated two files, so we select them and say delete. Now we can create our first layout, so we hit right click here, add, and we say user control. We name the user control test layout. We can now drag and drop elements from the toolbox, for instance, a text block element. If you do not see it automatically, you can bring up the the property window to the right bottom side, and here you can set all the properties of the elements in the same way that you would do it in the included ScreensPro designer. Here we say hello from Visual Studio. We can drag it around, we can play with the text appearance, we can make it bigger. Let's save it. Now let's test if it works in ScreensPro. So we start ScreensPro server. We're gonna create a new config saying Visual Studio test. We want to have a small HD resolution, so we select 960 by 540. Now we need to point it to the location where the Visual Studio project was created. If we go back to Visual Studio, we right click here and say Open Folder in Explorer. Now we can copy and paste the location and enter it here. Now, in order to test if it works, we can open the ScreensPro client application. We're going to go to layouts, add a layout, say test as a name, and then we select the test layout XAML file here and we hit the play button. Now we see that the text is cut off to the right. This is because in Visual Studio we didn't tell the layout to use these dimensions here. So we go back to Visual Studio, say width equals 960 and height equals 540. We just hit the save button here and then it is reflected here as well. Now let's create a new layout called clock layout, which we want to use for displaying a clock. Again, we specify the width 960 and the height 540. And now we want to use the clock element, which is coming with DBNetsoft ScreensPro. So we type here clock element. And you see here the squiggled lines means that the clock element is not found. This means we first have to add a reference to the ScreensPro library. So we go to dependencies, add project library. We say browse. And we go to the installation location of ScreensPro, which is C program files, DBNetsoft, ScreensPro. And we select screens.controls. Hit OK. And now this library is added here under assemblies as a dependency. Now if we go back to our what Visual Studio calls invalid markup and we hover over the clock element, we now have a yellow light bulb. If we go to the light bulb, it says, hey, I found this element, but we need to add a namespace for it first. And this namespace is added automatically by Visual Studio. If we do this, it gets prefixed with a namespace, which is in this case controls. Still, it is not updated here immediately, so this means we first have to build the project. We build the project by right-click and say build. After that, we see a nice running clock here. We're gonna increase the font size again, 36, so that works. We're gonna change the foreground. We can search here for properties, so we're gonna change the foreground to red. And we hit save. In order to check if that works, we go back to ScreensPro and the ScreensPro client. We add a new layout here, enabling clock layout XAML. We hit the play button and we see our red clock here. All right, let's define a free text layout. Let's click right here, add user control, free text layout. Same here for the free text layout. We want to have simply a text element. Again, this text element comes from our own library, so we need to add it to Visual Studio. Next thing we want to do is we want to add a free text layout. Now let's say add user controls, free text layout. we want to add the text element from our built-in library. So we go to controls dot text element. Again, Visual Studio here says, hey, in this layout, I don't know what this controls prefix is. So again, we go to the light bulb and we say add XMLNS screens controls. Set the color to white. The text property we set to test. And we see everything nicely here. We can rearrange it here in the editor. Now we have to give this test element a name, which is free text element. And now this free text element we can reference in the Screens client server. So we go here plus, we say judge, we say free text layout, and within this free text layout we set the free text element, its text property to judge. We hit the play button and we see it's called judge here. Now, the big benefit of using Visual Studio Project is that you can have styles that can be applied to all of the layouts. So we're going to add a style here. We're going to click add. This time it's not a user control, but a resource dictionary. We call this resource dictionary styles. Within this resource dictionary now, we can define common things. We can define, for instance, a solid color brush, give it the name of default foreground brush, and say, hey, as the default color for all text elements, let's please use yellow. Now we have defined this color brush inside our styles. The next thing we need to do is we need to tell each layout, hey, pick up the style file and apply this brush to the text element. So if we go back to the free text layout, we're gonna say, hey, foreground is not white, but it is of a dynamic resource called default foreground. Now it's not recognized here, could not be resolved. The reason is we have to also tell it use the styles XAML file. For this, we add this thing here, user control resources, and we're gonna add this resource dictionary called styles.xaml. Still, it's not reflected because it's not default foreground, but default foreground brush. If I do this, it automatically is yellow. Now let's copy and paste this one here to clock. Foreground is not red, also default foreground. It's not picking it up as we still need to link the style file. Copy this one, we paste it here. All right, now in Visual Studio it looks good. Let's have a look how it looks in the client and the render. We play the clock, nothing appears. We play the judge, nothing appears. Strange. Let's add warning logs in ScreensPro server. Clock, judge, nothing appears. The reason for this is if Visual Studio cannot find, or if ScreensPro cannot find any resource, it will default to the default colors or default font family or whatever is the default. In this case, we also need to tell the ScreensPro server, hey, please use this styles file. So we click here, right? We click here, we say settings, render manager, and we can define a list of style files. So we go here to style files, add, and we say styles.xaml. Now we need to restart ScreensPro. When loading, ScreensPro now says loaded styles. If we go to the ScreensPro client, we load the clock, it's yellow, and we load the judge, it's also yellow. I can even go now, have it side by side, and change my defaults here. and it is automatically reflected in the ScreensPro server. You can also change layouts, and that also is reflected automatically.